Montana Territory, August 1879. The wind tore across the open plains like it had a purpose, but not half as much purpose as the woman riding hellbent through the tall grass, a torn bridal veil fluttering behind her like a ghost. Mud spattered her skirts, her boots kicked against the horse's flanks, and her lungs burned with every breath. But she did not stop. Not when the sun burned high overhead, not when the gravel road cut her skin, not even when the bruises on her arms throbbed. Margery Whitlock had run straight from the church, from the preacher's stunned silence, from the gasps of her father's guests, from the cruel hands of the man they had promised her to. She had run for her life. She had no plan, just a horse she had stolen from the stable and a mind full of fear. Behind her, she knew Royce Tate would be coming. And Royce never let anything go without a fight, not debts, not land, and certainly not a woman he thought he owned. The ridge ahead dipped steeply into a dry wash. Her horse stumbled, caught itself, then charged on, hooves striking hard, packed earth. Margery leaned forward, urging the gelding faster. She had to get somewhere, anywhere, before Royce or her father caught up. Then, as if summoned by some desperate prayer, a figure appeared on the ridge to the west. A lone rider. Dust haloed him as he sat tall in the saddle, his hat low and his shoulders broad. His horse crested the ridge like it knew the land, calm and unhurried. Margery's heart lurched. She pulled the reins hard, slowing her horse, unsure whether to run or beg. The man watched her approach with narrowed eyes. His rifle was slung across his back, and a lasso hung loose at his side, but he made no move to reach for either. His horse shifted, sensing her panic. She stopped a dozen yards away, panting, a wild look in her eyes. "Help me," she said, voice hoarse. "Please, he's coming." The cowboy's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. He dismounted in one smooth motion, walking slowly toward her like she was a spooked colt. "I am not gonna hurt you," he said, voice low and steady. "Name's Thatch Dalton." Margery slid off her horse, knees buckling. "I ran from my wedding, from Royce Tate. He hit me when no one was looking. Said worse would come after the vows." Thatch's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the horizon, then back at her. "You got family chasing you. My father sold me off like cattle. He will not help. Royce will not stop." Thatch nodded once, then stepped forward and offered his hand. "You are safe now. You will ride with me." Margery blinked. "You do not even know me." He met her eyes. "I do not need to." "I saw enough." She took his hand. They rode west, him in the lead, her just behind. Thatch had a quiet way about him, like he had seen too much to waste words. His hat shaded his eyes, and the line of his shoulders stayed tense, like he expected trouble at every turn. They rode for over an hour until the sun dipped lower and the land turned rocky. He led her to a small homestead nestled against a bluff, just a worn barn, a low house, and a corral with 2 horses. It was plain, but it looked solid. Safe. Thatch helped her down, then walked her to the porch. "You can rest here. No one knows this place but me." "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He took a long breath. "Because I know what it is to be trapped. And because no decent man would let a woman face someone like Royce Tate alone." Inside, the house smelled of cedar and dust. A rifle rested by the door. The hearth held old ashes. Thatch poured her water and pushed a plate of bread and beans her way. Margery's hands trembled as she ate. That night, she lay on a cot in the corner while Thatch sat by the fire, whittling wood with a knife. He did not look at her much, but when he did, his eyes softened. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded. "You sleep now. I will keep watch." She did not know what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time since her father had signed her away, she felt like she could breathe. The next morning, Margery woke to the smell of bacon and the sound of horses in the corral. She stretched slowly, her muscles sore. Thatch stood at the stove, flipping eggs into a pan with practiced ease. "I can help," she said quickly, moving to stand. "You can sit," he replied, not unkindly. "You rest. We will talk after breakfast." She sat, watching him. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, forearms tanned strong. He moved with purpose, not wasted motion. After they ate, he poured coffee and leaned against the table. "There is a town 2 days south. If you want to go there, I will take you. Or if you want to stay hidden, we can ride deeper west." She looked down at her hands. "I do not know what I want." "Only that I am never going back." Thatch nodded. "Then you do not have to." They spent the day fixing a loose fence post and patching the barn roof. Margery worked beside him, sleeves rolled up, sweat on her brow. She had never done such labor before, but it felt better than sitting still. That evening they ate in silence. Then, as the sky turned orange behind the hills, Margery stepped out onto the porch. Thatch joined her, arms crossed. "You are not afraid now," he said. "I am still afraid," she admitted. "But not of you." He turned to her. "Good." She looked up at him, then away. "You could have turned me in, brought me back for a reward." "I do not want money," he said. "I want peace." Margery looked at him, really looked. There was something in his eyes, quiet strength, settled pain, a man who had seen the world break but kept standing. "I think," she said slowly, "I feel safe with you." Thatch's voice was husky. "You are." They stood close now. The wind tugged at her hair. The silence between them was not awkward, it felt like something waiting to happen. She reached for his hand. He took it, warm and steady. And in that moment something shifted. She had fled a cruel bridegroom, and she had found something better than escape. She had found a man who would never raise a hand to her. A man who offered protection not as ownership, but as choice. She had found Thatch Dalton. And he had not let her go. By the third day, the dust had settled on Margery's skin the same way it had begun to settle in her chest. She moved with more certainty now, tying her hair back with a strip of linen she'd found tucked in Thatch's old trunk. Sleeves rolled to her elbows as she swept the porch and beat dust from the saddle blankets. The morning sun came low and gold across the bluff, and she no longer flinched at the sound of hoofbeats in the distance. Thatch had spent the early hours checking rabbit snares he'd set the evening before. When he returned, he carried 2 hares by the legs and a look that said he'd seen something worth noting. "You ride out far?" Margery asked, brushing her hands on her skirt. "Up beyond Dry Willow Creek," he said, hanging the hares from a nail by the barn. "Found prints. 2 riders, maybe 3, coming from the north. Didn't cross the creek yet." She didn't speak right away. The breeze caught the hem of her dress, lifting it slightly before letting it fall again. "You think they're looking for me?" "I think they're looking for something," he said. "Could be you. Could be strays. Could be nothing." "But you don't believe in coincidence," she said, watching him. Thatch didn't answer that. He just walked toward the pump and washed the blood from his hands. Margery followed him inside once his boots crossed the threshold. She'd begun to know his movements well enough now to follow without needing words. When he sat at the table, she lit the kindling beneath the stove. "They'll keep riding," he said. "No sign they know this place is here." "You ever had to hide someone before?" she asked, not looking at him as she stirred cornmeal into a pot of boiling water. "No," he said, "but I've had to disappear." Margery let that sit between them. The only sound was the soft scrape of the wooden spoon against the pot. Then she said, "You were a soldier." Thatch looked up, but not with surprise. "I was." "Union," he nodded once. "You see much." "Enough." She didn't ask more. He didn't offer it. But something in her shifted again. The way it had the first time she'd looked into his face and seen steadiness instead of threat. After breakfast, they rode out a short distance to check on the cattle Thatch had let loose in the north pasture. Margery rode the smaller mare now, her posture straighter than it had been 3 days earlier. The saddle no longer felt like a foreign thing beneath her. She kept one hand on the horn, the other loose on the reins. "I'll need to go to town soon," Thatch said as they rode, "for salt, flour, new blades." Margery looked ahead where the land opened wide beneath the sky. "Will you be gone long? Just overnight. I'll leave at dawn, be back by the next." She didn't answer right away. "Then, I don't want to stay here alone." He turned his head slightly toward her, not slowing his horse. "I won't ask you to." "I could come with you," she said, "if I wore different clothes." Kept my head low. "It's risky." "So is everything." He didn't argue further, and that, more than anything, told her he was letting her choose. That night they sat on the porch again, but farther apart than before. A coyote howled in the distance, and the stars had begun their slow climb. Margery held a blanket around her shoulders, not for cold, but for something else she couldn't name. "You ever think about starting over?" she asked. Thatch picked a sliver of wood from beneath his nail. "I did once. After the war, thought maybe I'd go east. Try my hand at carpentry." "What stopped you?" He let out a quiet breath. Didn't want to build houses for men who never fought. Seemed wrong somehow. She studied him. "So you came out here." "Didn't plan to stay," he said. "But the land keeps a man honest." She nodded. "I never knew what honest looked like until now." He turned his head, eyes steady on her. "You still thinking about Royce?" "No," she said. "I'm thinking about how I don't want to be afraid anymore." There was a long silence. Then Thatch stood, walked down the steps, and looked out over the open dark. "You're not," he said. "Not here." Margery didn't go inside right away. She stayed on the porch long after he'd gone in, watching the moon rise. Tomorrow she would ride with him into town, dressed in clothes from his trunk, her hair tucked beneath a man's hat. She didn't know what they would find there, but she knew who she'd ride beside, and that was enough. By first light, Margery had bound her hair flat beneath the brim of an old felt hat and buttoned herself into a faded canvas shirt that hung past her hips. The trousers Thatch lent her were cinched tight with a strip of leather, and the boots, even stuffed with rags, pinched her toes. Still, she didn't complain. She mounted without needing help and kept her gaze low as they rode out. The trail south bent along a ridge of cottonwoods and dropped into a gulch where water pooled in the low season. Thatch kept a steady pace, his rifle lashed to the saddle horn, eyes sweeping the horizon. Margery followed close, her hands steady on the reins. They didn't speak until the land started to rise again, the slope bringing them to a narrow cut between bluffs. A kestrel circled overhead, then dove into the brush. "She'll find something to eat," Margery said, watching it disappear. Thatch didn't look over. "She knows where to land." They reached town just after midday. A cluster of buildings leaned into the dirt street livery, dry goods, a smithy, and a saloon with faded curtains drawn against the sun. Heat shimmered off the roof shingles. A few boys kicked a stone near the well, their shirts damp with sweat. No one paid them much mind as Thatch tied off their horses in front of the mercantile. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of flour sacks and kerosene. A woman behind the counter nodded to Thatch, then glanced at Margery without comment. Thatch handed over a folded list and stepped to the side. Margery wandered to a shelf stacked with bolts of calico. Her fingers brushed a length of blue cloth, coarse but softening at the edge. "You ever think of setting roots somewhere else?" she asked. Thatch didn't lift his eyes from the tins he was sorting through. "What makes you think I haven't? You live back in a hollow with a barn that needs new slats and a table built from crate wood." He gave a quiet huff. "That table's held up longer than most things I've built." She smiled behind the brim of the hat and turned back to the cloth. "Still, you ever think of making something permanent?" "I did once." What changed? He met her gaze. It didn't last. She didn't ask more. Outside, a wagon rattled by, the wheels kicking up chalky dust. She watched it pass, then turned back to Thatch. "I'd like to sew something. If we have needles." "We've got 3 if I haven't stepped on the last one." He paid and loaded the supplies into a sack. As they stepped outside, a man across the street straightened from where he'd been leaning against the saloon post. He wore a brown duster and leaned on his left side like he favored it. His eyes narrowed. Thatch's arm brushed hers, subtle and firm. "Mount up." She didn't argue. Her legs swung over the saddle before she even looked back. The man didn't follow, just watched as they rode out, his expression unreadable. They didn't speak again until the town was a dust blur behind them. The trail stretched long, shadows growing sharp beneath the horses' hooves. A hawk passed overhead, silent and swift. "Who was he?" Margery asked. "Don't know, but he looked like the kind that listens more than he talks." "You think he recognized me? If he did, he'll talk to someone about it." Her stomach tightened. "We'll have to be ready." "I always am." That night, Thatch built a fire low under the stars, the flames just enough for warmth. Margery sat across from him, her knees pulled close, stitching a torn shirt with one of the needles he'd dug out of his kit. Her hands worked slowly, the thread tugging clean through the fabric. "I never learned to cook," she said, "or mend, or wash dishes right." "Doesn't take much to learn," Thatch said, "just patience." "My mother had none for it." Said a girl with a proper face didn't need calluses. He tossed another twig on the fire. "You've got more use in your hands than any face I've seen." She looked up at him, the needle paused in her fingers. "I mean that plain," he added. "I know." She smiled, small and real. "I believe you." The fire popped, sending an ember into the dirt. She leaned back on her elbows, the shirt half sewn in her lap. "You ever think of marrying?" she asked. He stared into the flames. "Didn't seem fair. Not after the war. Not with the way I came back." "How did you come back?" Harder, quieter, and with blood on my hands that wasn't all enemy. She was quiet for a while. "Then we all carry something." He looked up. "What do you carry?" "My name. My silence. And a fear that if I stop moving, he'll find me." Thatch didn't speak. Instead, he reached across the space between them and took the needle from her hand. He finished the stitch without a word, then handed it back. "You don't have to run anymore. I'm not ready to stop. Then we'll ride until you are." The horses shifted in the dark, their tails swishing at flies. The fire burned low. Margery didn't sleep far from him that night, and neither of them woke afraid. By the time the sun cleared the eastern rim of the hills, they were already riding again, leaving the shallow campfire cold behind them. Thatch kept a steady path west through a corridor of bent pines and dry sage. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The trail was narrow, and the horses picked their way over stone and root. They'd passed no signs of riders since leaving town. Still, Thatch watched the skyline the way a man does who's been hunted before. They reached a shallow basin near midday, where cottonwoods leaned heavy over a spring-fed pool. The horses drank deep. Margery stepped down and walked toward the water's edge, her boots sinking slightly in the damp earth. She cupped water to her mouth without lifting her eyes. Behind her, Thatch unpacked their bread and dried meat. "I was thinking," she said, voice low, "about that man in town. His coat was too heavy for the heat." Thatch tore off a piece of bread. "Could be he wanted to hide the iron on his hip." "He didn't draw," she said. "Doesn't need to if he's just watching." She turned then, brushing her hands on her thighs. "What happens if Royce sends someone worse next time?" Thatch looked up. "Then we handle it." Margery's mouth tightened. "I don't want you getting shot for me. I don't plan to." He finished chewing, then added, "But I'm not letting you go back. I know." She sat beside him on the grass. The shade was cool there, and the hum of insects filled the space between their words. "My mother left when I was 7, she said. I used to think she'd come back for me, that she just needed time to get away from him." Thatch didn't move. "She never did," Margery said, brushing a blade of grass between her fingers. "When I was old enough, I stopped asking." And he stopped pretending to have answers. Thatch leaned back on his elbows, hat tipped slightly to shade his eyes. "You think she ran for the same reason you did? She never told me anything, but I saw the bruises." He was quiet a moment. "Then, you're not her. I know that. You stayed until you couldn't. That takes grit." She looked down at her hands. "I wish I'd left sooner." "You left when you could. That's what matters." They didn't speak again until the shadows lengthened. As they packed to leave, Margery reached for the rifle that Thatch usually kept strapped to his saddle. "Let me carry it," she said. He studied her a moment, then passed it over without a word. They rode until dusk, climbing up into a ridge of flat-topped stone and low scrub. Thatch pointed to a cleft between two outcroppings where the rock dipped into a shallow hollow. "We'll camp there. Can't be seen from the trail." Margery nodded and followed him in. Later, as the fire threw flickers against the rock, she sat cross-legged near the warmth and pulled a small folded paper from her pocket. "What's that?" Thatch asked, nodding toward it. "My mother's hymn book page. The only thing she left behind." He leaned forward slightly. "You carry it always, even when I didn't know why." She handed it to him. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. "Be still, my soul. The Lord is on thy side." Thatch read it once, then passed it back. "You still believe it?" "I want to." "You believe it more now than you did a week ago?" She looked at him, eyes steady. "Yes." They watched the fire for a long while after that. The coyotes didn't call that night. The wind stayed low. Margery lay close beneath the blanket, her back to the stone, her rifle resting beside her. When Thatch settled in beside her, she turned slightly, not touching, but near. "You ever think about staying?" she asked. He didn't shift. "I do now." Her voice was quiet. "With me?" He looked at her then, his eyes catching the firelight. "Only with you." She didn't answer with words, just reached out slow and sure until her hand found his. They slept with their fingers twined, and nothing in the night came to break that peace. They reached Thatch's homestead by late afternoon the next day. The light had shifted, gentler now as late summer began to lean toward fall. Dust clung to their shirts and the horses' manes, and the edges of the world felt quieter, settled somehow. The barn stood where they'd left it, weathered but upright, and the corral rail still bore the mark of Thatch's last repair. Margery dismounted first, her legs stiff but sure beneath her. She led the mare toward the trough while Thatch unlashed their supplies with steady hands. Neither of them spoke until the horses were watered and the crates opened on the porch. Inside, the light caught on the iron stove, and the long-handled tools hung in their places. Thatch set a small wrapped bundle on the table and peeled back the cloth to reveal a tin of coffee and a square of dried cherries. Margery touched the fruit with her fingertips. "I didn't ask for anything sweet," she said, quiet and surprised. "You didn't have to," he said, lifting his hat and setting it on the wall hook by the door. She turned toward him then, her hands still resting on the edge of the table. "You always look out ahead, like your mind's one step further than your words." He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Spent a long time not being able to say what I wanted. Habits hard to unlearn." Margery looked at the floorboards a moment before stepping forward. "What do you want now?" His voice was low. "You, here, if you wanted to." She didn't hesitate. "I do." The space between them closed with a quiet certainty. She rested her palm against his chest and he laid his hand over hers, solid and warm. The moment held, not rushed, not unsure, just truth drawn in the stillness. Later, After a supper of fried salt pork and beans, they sat by the window with the shutters open to let in the dusk. The land stretched wide beyond the porch, the wind brushing low over the grass. Thatch handed her a folded scrap of paper, the edges worn. "I filed a land claim for the next parcel west," he said. "So there's room if we build more." Margery unfolded it, eyes scanning the coordinates. "What would we build?" "Whatever you'd like. A room with windows facing the ridge, a barn that doesn't lean. A place that's yours as much as mine." She folded the paper again and held it in her lap. "And if someone comes asking, they'll leave empty-handed," he said. "Or not leave at all," she nodded. "Then we'll start tomorrow." That night there were no separate corners, no distance kept. The cot remained folded, untouched. They lay side by side beneath the stitched quilt, the night outside cool but quiet. She traced the lines of his knuckles with her thumb, and he brushed her temple with the back of his fingers. "You sleep light," she said, her voice a whisper. "Not tonight." When morning broke, they rose early and began clearing the ground near the bluff. Thatch swung the axe with practiced rhythm while Margery raked the cleared brush into piles. Her dress caught on a thorn branch once, and he came to cut it free, his hands careful not to tear the fabric. She laughed when he cursed the stubborn bramble under his breath. Each day after, they worked. He taught her to drive nails without splitting the wood, and she showed him how to hem the curtain cloth she'd chosen from the mercantile. They built the new room with wide windows and a door that opened toward the ridge. Thatch added a porch rail from cedar, and Margery carved a small wooden bird to sit on the post. No one came searching. No riders passed close enough to raise alarm. The world shifted again, slow and steady, into something they shaped together. In the quiet hours, they sat near the fire, his hand always finding hers. He spent less time watching the horizon, and she no longer startled awake in the dark. She read aloud from the old hymnbook page once, her voice strong now, and he listened with his eyes closed, as if he could feel each word like a stone laid into place. One morning, after the first frost touched the grass, Margery stood at the edge of the porch with her hand resting on her belly. The wind curled the hem of her shawl and the air smelled of pine. Thatch stepped behind her, his arms circling her waist. "You sure?" she nodded. "I am." He didn't speak, just pressed his mouth to her hair, holding her as the wind moved around them. They married in the spring, just the two of them and the ridge birds bearing witness. No preacher, just vows spoken plain in the clearing behind the new room they'd built. Thatch wore his best shirt. Margery wore a dress she'd sewn herself, the blue calico faded soft. He tied a strip of her mother's hymnbook ribbon around her wrist, and she placed a carved cedar ring on his finger, shaped from the porch rail he'd built for her. Years passed, and the land held. The barn stood strong through hail and dust. Their child was born in the room with the wide windows, sunlight spilling across the quilt Margery had stitched through the long winter. They named the boy Samuel, after no one in particular, just a name that felt clean and honest. Thatch taught him how to mend a fence and listen before speaking. Margery taught him to read and to never raise his voice in anger. The boy grew with wide shoulders and quiet eyes, and the house they built never lacked for warmth. They aged together without fear, without need to run. The scars they carried never vanished, but they no longer hurt. They became part of the story, part of what made the quiet mornings feel earned. And every evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, they sat on the porch side by side, their hands laced together, watching the light stretch across the land they'd claimed not just with signatures and deeds, but with love, with labor, and with the kind of peace neither of them had ever thought they'd find. They never left, and they never needed to.